1994, I was appointed Tioga County historian, and I bumped into a young lady there who at the time was the Owego town historian, Emma Seedorf. And Emma went on, after I left, to become the county historian. And Emma told me a story. And she said, hey, I know you're interested in this military history. I know you're interested in the Civil War era. Did you ever hear of this guy from Owego, New York, Benjamin W. Loring, who allegedly was at Ford's Theater April 14th, 1865, and came into contact with President Lincoln that night when the president was assassinated? I said, no, but isn't that interesting? And it's about the same time when I started teaching United States history, 11th grade. So I used to teach, well, I taught basically all of it at one point or another, but 11th and 12th grade. And there are a few students here that I recognize. Some of my very earliest students are in the crowd this evening. And Melvin, I'm telling you, don't tell any stories. So those were...
I'm not here to steal your books.
You know, and I knew that would come up. So you'll have to ask them sometime because they pulled a good one. And then some other students later on who would suffer through my classes. But it was early on that it was very clear to me very quickly that you've got to do something to garner their attention in the classroom. Why should they pay attention? Who cares? You're 16, 17 years old. Who cares what happened to somebody else somewhere else? And therein lies the crux of all of this and what really started this. And that was, you need to find a way to engage the students in the classroom on a daily basis. And what better way to do that than talk about the local history that happened here? Who cares what happened in Missouri if you're in New York? But you might care about what happened on Humeston Street. And if you don't know about Humeston Street, you're not going to pass the quiz at the end of the night. So, you better know about Amos Humeston or else you're in big trouble. So it was that. It was that prompted me to go to the libraries, to go to the historical societies, to talk with folks, to gather that information, to bring back into the classroom, not to present entire lectures about that. We had a Regents curriculum to get through, but little tidbits here and there. And suddenly you would notice throughout the course of the year, students were leaning forward in their desks. It's like, oh, wasn't that an interesting little tidbit? But the best measurement of all was when they came back into school the next day and said, oh, well, I mentioned to mom or dad last night this. It's like, you remembered, and now there's a conversation going on. I've done my job. That's how this gets started. And that leads us to this man. Benjamin W. Loring, originally from Duxbury, Massachusetts, finds himself in 1860 out in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. What's going on out there? There's gold. There's gold. Lots and lots of gold. But Ben Loring's a really smart guy. He's not a gold miner. He's making a fortune by taking supplies up into the mountains for the gold miners. So in the 1860 census, we place him out there. And when you look at that, it states, Benjamin W. Loring, packer. So he and 3 other guys are packing materials up and out into the mountains. In 1861, when the war begins, the Civil War begins, Loring finds himself out there. He's working with his younger brother Bailey and 2 other gentlemen. And Loring says, hey, you know, something big is going on back east. It's not right. He's very upset about this. Now, he had spent 20-odd years previous to all of that on various ships sailing around the world. He had started as a cabin boy, worked his way up through the ranks, eventually would become a captain, a merchant captain on these ships. Keep running over here. So by 1861, the war gets going. It's April. The Battle of First Bull Run occurs. It's a mess. Ball's Bluff, if you're not familiar with it, another big mess. So now it's very late 1861, and Loring realizes this war's not going to end in 3 months. It's going to continue. So we've got to do something. And he tells his younger brother, I need to get into the fight. And you're going to hear that, you're going to see that, if you get a chance to read the book. I need to get into the fight. So he leaves his business to his younger brother and says, I'm heading back east. He jumps on board, or in a mail coach, not a stagecoach, a mail coach, just piled with bags of mail. And he rides on this thing for 12 days back east. That's what he does. He gets back to Washington, D.C., says, I need to get into the fight. and he enlists in the Navy. Of course, with his previous experience in the Navy, it makes a good fit. He's made an officer, he's an acting master. Now you see up here it says captain. That is a courtesy rank. He never achieves the rank of captain. He'll achieve the rank of lieutenant, and he'll command a ship, the commanding officer of a ship, but he never achieves the rank. So people will often refer to him as Captain Loring. That's a courtesy. He was in charge of the ship. Call him captain. So there he is, Benjamin W. Loring. Goes to Washington. He's there. He enlists. Meets with his family. Says a very tearful goodbye to them. His sister Lily hands him a little keepsake, a little tiny knife, a little tiny penknife, which is very important that you remember that, because we're going to come back to it, and it plays an extremely large role in the events in Ford's Theater. So his sister hands him this knife. Off he goes to the seat of war, and he finds himself eventually in early 1862 down in Virginia, which is where I now live. It's like Mecca if you're into the Civil War. That's where you go. And he's there. He's at Drury's Bluff. Big battle there. For gallantry in action and so forth, he's promoted to lieutenant. Takes command of a ship. He takes that from the upper reaches of the Mississippi, heads down to New Orleans, and then he's given orders and he's told, you need to head out to Louisiana. And you're going to take command of this ship. This is the USS Argosy. It's a tin-clad. And they call it a tin-clad because it was basically a wooden barge designed to haul cattle and some cotton and so forth on the rivers. And they throw a little bit of thin iron sheeting over it. And they call it a tin-clad. They put some cannon on it to make it look ominous, I guess. And off it goes. Now, this is not an actual sketch of the Argosy. There was another ship called, or excuse me, this is the Argosy. I apologize. But there were two of them. Why? I don't know why. There were two of them, Argosy 1 and Argosy 2. So, you know, we're going to say, oh, you must be in charge of Argosy 1, now I'm in charge of Argosy 2. So they changed the name to the USS Wave. So Lieutenant Benjamin Loring is the commanding officer of the USS Wave. It looked exactly like that. So he takes this ship, which has a shallow draft. In other words, it only takes about 4.5 feet of water to float this thing, which is great if you're on the rivers. You get up and down the rivers, no issue. But if you take this out into the ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, you got a serious, serious problem. You're going to have to read the book to figure out what happens there.
Oh boy.
So here he is. Loring comes down, New Orleans. We're going to come out into this area. This is Louisiana. Now, for those of you who know me, you know, you get something in my head, I got to go do it. And a year ago, in November and early December, my wife said, you got some real serious closure issues here. And I said, yeah, can you tell? I need to go to Texas and Louisiana. So I flew out there. I flew out for a week and followed Loring's adventure, if you will, and stood in those locations. We'll talk more about that. But in 1864, Loring takes the Wave. He has 59 men on board. He has several cannon. And his orders are simple. Go out to the Calcasieu River in Louisiana, go up into the river, and there's a guy up there named Duncan Smith. Find him and any Union sympathizers that are there and any cattle, load them on board and bring them back safely to New Orleans. It's that simple, you would think. Off he goes. He has a sister ship with him, the USS Granite City. The two of the ships head out there. They go to what is today Cameron, Louisiana. They head up the Calcasieu River. They fire a few shots into a Confederate fort. Turns out the fort's abandoned. And in the meantime, they have to fight the weather. Now these ships run on coal. That's what fires up and fuels these engines and the boilers to make the steam to run everything. The problem is, to get out there, he burns up all but his final half-ton of coal. So he gets there, and it's like, I don't have any more gas. I need some gas. I need some coal. So he sends word back to New Orleans, send a collier out there. I need some coal. Nothing shows up. Days go by. He sends another note back to New Orleans. Please, I need some coal. Nothing. The man sitting there with his ship dead in the water. They're scavenging for driftwood to throw into the boilers. to fire it up, but he's sitting at anchor with cold boilers. Now, not too far from there, over in Texas, there are 350 Confederates. And they know that Loring and these two ships are there, and they're not happy about it. They're going to do something about it. Loring, again, pleads with the authorities in New Orleans, send us some coal. In fact, this time he says, I've got to send a person out there. He takes his paymaster, puts him on another ship, and they send him back to personally plead with the authorities, in this case Admiral Porter, I need some coal. Nothing arrives. So, May 6th, 1864, sun's rising, Laurie's out on the deck of the USS Wave, drinking his coffee, looking out, thinking, what a glorious day this is going to be when a Confederate shell comes whizzing by his head and strikes the Wave. The battle begins. 350 Confederates, there are 59 men on board the USS Wave, just a few more than that on board the Granite City. The problem at this point is Loring has no coal. He cannot fire up his engines very quickly. They get in there, they put fire to the driftwood, start to build some steam, but at this point the Confederates have flanked them. A shell comes through, right through the center of the ship, into the boilers, lets all the steam out. Loring is dead in the water. Within a half an hour, the Granite City strikes its colors and surrenders. Loring and his 59 men continue to fight, 350 guys on shore. For an hour and a half, he holds them off. The bullets are flying by, the cannonballs are coming past him. He damn near has his leg taken off when one of his cannon break loose from the deck boards of his tinclad. And finally, after about 25 of these men have gone down with wounds, he realizes, what's going to happen here? I don't know that we can continue this fight. And he does the unthinkable. And he tells us in his personal journal, I would rather die 1,000 deaths than do what I'm about to do, and that is surrender my ship. And on May 6, 1864, Lieutenant Loring does just that. He surrenders the USS Wave. He's taken prisoner. He and his crew, they come across into Texas, up across the Houston and Texas Central Railroad, and they end up here in Camp Gross, just outside of Hempstead, Texas. I stood there. In 1864, this is what it looked like. This is a sketch. There are no known photos of the camp, but this is the only known sketch that I've been able to find of Camp Gross. Very small place, about 5-6 acres in total enclosure. There's really nothing there today. Farm fields, I'll show you that here in a second. Originally, it was a camp of instruction. This is where the Confederate soldiers would go to learn to become soldiers. And by 1863, it was doing double duty as a POW camp and a camp of instruction. But by 1864, it's a POW camp. And in charge of the camp is the Confederate Colonel Gillespie. How many of you have heard of Andersonville? Okay. Everybody's heard of Andersonville. That's Elmira? Yeah, I don't ask that one down south. Yeah. We should talk about that sometime. Yankee down south. Because I am a Yankee down south. But very few people have heard of Camp Gross, if any. Very few. And Colonel Gillespie, according to Benjamin Loring, is as notorious as the commanding officer of Andersonville, Henry Wirtz. And he tells us that in his personal journal. In fact, he describes Gillespie as Wirtz-like. For those of you who don't quite remember, Wirtz is the only war criminal hanged after the Civil War. This is Camp Gross. This is Camp Gross today. So I told you, I took a week and I went out there. And there's a gentleman he's in the United States Army, Daniel Francis Lizzarelli, and he's done tremendous work and research to find and document and preserve Camp Gross. Thank God for him. So if you're looking for a book related to that, Camp Gross, The Last Confederate Prison, Daniel Lizzarelli. It's a great book. Wonderful guy. So while I was out there, called him up. We had made arrangements, and he spent an entire day with me showing me the grounds of Camp Gross and related locations. But this is it today. It's a farm field. Across the road from this, there's what they call the somber hillock, which is, we believe, part of the POW cemetery. And we were standing there, and I'm standing there with Daniel, and there are a couple of trees and some brush out there. And you could see a couple of areas that had slumped. And I'm sure, I am 90% sure that those are graves. And there were multiple locations. So I'm sure he has the right location there. So Loring is there. So in 1864, May, he's captured, surrenders the ship, off he goes. He's incarcerated now in Camp Gross. But he continues to receive letters. So he's writing to his sister. He's not married at this point. He's writing to his sister Lily, the one that gave him the penknife. And this is one of the envelopes that he receives. So I need to say a thank you right now to John Loring Ham and his wife Terry. They're in Pittsburgh, and John is the great-grandson of Benjamin Loring. Not the great. One great. Civil War wasn't that long ago. If you really think about it, 2 lifetimes. 153 years ago would have been 1865. So about 2 lifetimes. The family has done an outstanding job of preserving the artifacts, letters, documents, journals, you name it. They have it. It is an absolute treasure trove. And they were kind enough to allow me to borrow that for 4 years to write this book. And this is part of that. And inside that envelope was a letter from his sister. And so what's interesting about this is it says, Lieutenant Benjamin W. Loring, USN, late of the USS Wave, prisoner of war, Camp Gross, Texas, and by flag of truce. So that's how that letter was delivered. That letter had to come through Confederate lines under a flag of truce, and Ben Loring received that while he was in Camp Gross. There are dozens of letters like this that the family has. Dozens. It's amazing. And they just found 87 more, which I'm hoping will lead to the next book. Loring's not one to rest on his laurels. He's a New Englander. He's of hardy stock, and he doesn't want to be in Camp Gross. Nobody does, but he really doesn't want to be there. So by July, so he's captured in May. By July 4th, he said, "I'm done. I need to get out of here. I need to get out of here. It's getting late in the war. It's 1864. Aren't many resources. The Confederates don't have much. Imagine now, not a lot of food, kind of starvation rations. You know, you don't change your clothes every day, kind of a thing." So Loring says, "I'm done. I'm getting out of here." He works with 2 other POWs, and they make a plan for escape. And in the wee hours of July 5th, very early July 5th, he and 2 other officers decide to make a run at the wall. They're going to see if they can squeeze through. They pried open a board a little bit. They snuck around. Loring actually came up with some camouflage that he kind of sewed together. They're going to go through this. At the last minute, one of those officers doesn't show up, and the other one loses his nerve and runs back. Runs back into the officer's quarters. So Loring's left there. All of a sudden, as he's trying to figure out what the heck am I going to do, somebody comes running up behind him, and it's one of the other officers from the Wave, an ensign, Peter Howard. Now, Peter is of Cajun, French descent. He has surprised Loring, kind of came up from behind him on a whim, and we know that because he's not wearing any shoes, doesn't have any food with him. He basically heard that, hey, Loring's heading out, and you know what, I'm going too, and I'm going to go find this guy, and off they go. So he meets Loring. Loring's kind of surprised. They decide, all right, we're going to squeeze through the fence here, the stockade wall. They're able to do that, wiggle their way through, and off they go. And they're going to head straight south. So here it is. Here's Hempstead, July 4th, early morning hours of July 5th, and down they go. Now, how do we know that? If you're a historian, you got to ask yourself, how do we know that? Carl's asking, how do you know that? Because Loring tells us, and this is one of the most amazing pieces to this whole story. Loring has a personal journal, and he tells us. He tells us where he's been. He tells us the date. Tells us where he's going. Tells us who he's with. It's right there. Now you got to be able to read it, but he tells us that. He tells us that. So off he goes. He will nickname Peter Howard Doe, which is Loring's version of the French John Doe. So off they go. For 10 days and 200 miles, they are on the run. Very little food. The doe doesn't have any shoes. Loring's not real happy with him because of that. They head out, and within about 10 miles, they realize this guy, the doe, is not going to make it. He's running barefoot. His feet are already chewed up. They're cut. I've got to do something. So what does Loring do? He reaches into his pocket, and guess what's in his pocket? A penknife. That little penknife is in his pocket. He pulls that out, takes his blanket, cuts it up, and uses that to make moccasins for the doe. He wraps up his feet for him, and off they go. So for 10 days, they're heading south. It is hot. There's no food. There's very little water. They're swimming. They're nearly drowning. It's awful. It's awful. They head through places like this. This is the Neches River. Doesn't look like a river. Didn't look like a river when I was out there. It's a swamp. I'm telling you, it's a swamp. So they're going through this. At some point, they make a raft. Actually, they make several rafts and start to float down these rivers. The Lavaca River on the left and the Navidad on the right. This is the junction to form the Lavaca as it heads further south. I stood there, obviously, I took the photo, but Loring tells us, I stood here at the junction of these two rivers. This is the route that we took. And so as I'm out there following this, I can say, my God, we know that Loring the doe passed exactly here. We know that. They continue on. They head down the Colorado River. They come very close to being captured because there are 3,000 Confederates on the opposite side of the river. And it's here that the doe makes something of a confession, and that is, he looks at Loring and says, you know, I know we've got to get across the river, but I can't swim. I can't swim. I don't know how to swim. Now, Loring was a very strong swimmer. He grew up in Boston, and, you know, that's what kids did back in those days. Let's get down to the creek and we'll go swimming. So Loring says, well, we'll just make a raft. And at this point, the doe's had it. Peter Howard has had it. I'm not making another raft. I'm swimming, and by God, I'm going to die getting across this river. So we're just going. And off he goes. Now, I snuck down here. I wasn't supposed to be in this park. So it's Beeson's, and there was some flooding. You're familiar with that. And you can see the tree coming down here, but I snuck down here because I wanted to get a closer photo. The bank there where that tree is, it's about 12 feet down to the river. And it's vertical. It's just straight up and down. And for as far as you can see, that's the way it is. And Loring describes the fact that the river was high, there had been some flooding, and here's this guy, Doe, he's got to get across the river. He gets down in there, jumps into the river, and he just disappears. I mean, the current just takes him, and off he goes. And Loring's just, my God, I think he's gone. So they do make it across the other side. They avert these 3,000 Confederates, and they continue on. They get to a point now where, check the next slide. Nope, can't do that one yet. So we get to a point where they're just running out of strength. I mean, they've been running now for 15, 18 days, or excuse me, 8, 9 days, and they're just out of strength. They're getting very, very close. They're trying to make it to Matagorda Bay. And if they can get to Matagorda Bay, they think they can get on a ship and then head east toward New Orleans. But as they're getting closer and closer and closer, they get down into those salt flats. And it is super hot. It's approaching 100 degrees. There's no water. These guys are dying of thirst. They had borrowed a rowboat that was leaky. They had tried to row their way out. And at this point, they knew they had to find water. So they pull the boat up on shore, and there's a gentleman who just kind of appears out of the bushes. And really surprises Doe and Loring. They say, geez, you know, we're looking for some water. This guy says, if you go out to the point, there's an old plantation that had been burned. The well is still out there, the cistern. I'm sure that there's water out there. But you better be careful, the wind is picking up, and if you get around the point here, you're going to really run into some heavy water. They get back in that rowboat, they head around the point, and it just about swamps them. They pull back on shore, they make it to the point, and they head up and they're searching for this cistern. They finally find it. It takes about a half a mile inland to find that. They get to the well, They're essentially dying of thirst. There they are. They look down and, yeah, fresh water. But they don't have any way to get it. They don't have any way to get it. So they search through the rubble. They find an old nail keg. And they've got a container, but now they need something to lower it down.
Yeah.
Loring crawls back. He crawls back to that little rowboat, finds some fishing line in it, hobbles back again, and they use that to get the water. While they're doing that, and after they slake their thirst, they're just exhausted. So Dido, they find a little shed. Dido kind of snuggles up in there and falls asleep.
Yeah.
Loring's just too wired. He can't sleep. So he's just sitting there. And all of a sudden, on the wind, he hears something. Thinks he hears voices. And off in the distance, about 200 yards away, he sees the sunlight glinting off of something. And he kind of looks, does a double take, hears something on the wind moving toward them, sees the sun glinting off of something, and suddenly realizes, those are bayonets. Those are bayonets coming toward me.
Oh.
And now he hears the voices more clearly. And he kind of says, Dido, wake up. Something's going on. Wake up.
Yeah.
Dido doesn't wake up. And now it's very clear that there are Confederate soldiers coming their way. Loring sees them come up over a rise, sees the barrels first, hears those voices, and finally gives Dido a good elbow to wake him up. Holy cow. So there's a sergeant now, Confederate sergeant, and I think there were 3 or 4 soldiers with him. And they know that Loring and Dido are there. And they call out and say, you need to come out with your hands up.
Oh boy.
Loring tries to talk his way out of it. He's not able to do that. I've stood on that point. They were 10 miles from freedom. 10 miles. They had traveled 200 miles and came within 10 miles of making it to freedom. And they were recaptured. And they are sent back to Camp Gross.
Oh.
As they arrive at Camp Gross, the commanding officer, Colonel Gillespie, meets them at the gate. He doesn't let them in. You're not coming in here.
Oh boy.
And he shakes his fist at them and says, I can catch you every time.
Oh.
You can't get away from me. That's a quote. Loring tells us that is a quote. The commanding officer gives each man a threadbare blanket and sends them off to the Andersonville prison, Grimes County Prison. And that's where they're going to spend the next 2 months. They're returned to Camp Gross in October. Their health has deteriorated, and Loring realizes something's got to give. About that same time, a yellow fever epidemic breaks out. So yellow fever is passed on by mosquitoes. At the time, they didn't know that. They thought it was some kind of miasmatic something in the air that you might catch. They didn't realize it was passed by mosquitoes. So Gillespie takes the entire camp and moves them across the countryside. So what are you going to do now with 500 men? Because they've been adding POWs into this camp. He takes them, off they go, and Gillespie finds these low-lying areas, you might as well call them swamps because that's what they are, and puts the prisoners down in there. The guards are up on the skirts area, skirting around that, the higher ground, and they keep them down in there. Men are dying daily. Daily. And Loring talks about, what am I supposed to do for my men? Now here's an interesting piece. He's a prisoner of war, yet he's paroled. He's paroled daily because he's an officer. He's allowed to go out, wander around the countryside as long as he comes back before sundown. The officers, some of the officers were allowed to do that. Loring's a senior officer, so he's allowed to go out and do that. And so he goes around the countryside and he knocks on doors. I'm a poor Yankee prisoner, and I'm looking for some food or medicine or clothing for my men. And many of the people in the countryside would give things to Loring, and he would bring them back and share them with his men. And he became very friendly with a Dr. Trainum and Dr. Trainum's daughter, Posey. And he would go there almost daily, and they would give him sugar, medicine, clothing, and he would always take that back and give that to his men. By early November, the epidemic had passed, and Gillespie takes all of these men and marches them back to Camp Gross. Now, if you've been starving for 7 and 8 months, how do you walk 15 or 20 miles, whatever that might be? Men died on the walk back to the prison and were simply buried on the side of the road. Loring realizes at this point he's not going to make it through the war unless he gets out of Camp Gross. So he hatches a plan with another officer in the prison, a Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Flory of the 46th Indiana Regiment. And the two of them decide we need to escape. But we're not going through the wall. We're not going to squeeze through there. We're not jumping over the top. We're going to walk out the front gate.
Oh boy.
So it's November in Texas. I've been out there. Gets cold at night. Warms up during the day, but it gets cold at night. Enough so there's skim ice out there. So a lot of the POWs are going outside the prison gates. They're being paroled. They take their blanket with them, and they're gathering up dry grass. And they're using that as insulation. They bring it back inside. They're using it as bedding. They're stuffing their clothes with it. They're using it as insulation. So Loring says, yeah, that's what we're going to do. We're going to forge a pass, and we're going out that front gate, and we're going to go get some of this grass, but we're not going back. And that's the plan. So on November 12th, 1864, Loring and Flory take forged passes, and they walk out that front gate. Hand it to the corporal. The corporal looks at it. Yep, you're Lieutenant Loring. Okay, go get your grass. Off they go. Once they get out there in the tall grass, they simply hunker down and wait for dark. Now, I don't know why nobody's checking to see who's coming back in.
Yeah, right.
I don't know. All I know is it's late in the war. These guys are going. So, November 12th, 1864, Loring and Flory head out that front gate. They wait for dark, and off they go. This time, they're not going straight south. But they have another piece in their arsenal that is so very, very important, and this is it. And this is why I say this is amazing what the family has. This is the escape pass that Loring uses for his second escape. So this is forged, and it says, Headquarters, Anderson's Battalion, Rusk, Texas, November 12, 1864. He gives it special orders. Okay, he's got a sense of humor. Special orders. Now, this is great. He takes an alias.
Oh, you're not. Back at it.
He takes an alias, and he calls himself Private B.S. Henderson. Now, I've talked to John about this. I said, John, your great-grandfather's got a sense of humor. He goes, what do you mean? I said, hey, he's B.S. Henderson. What's the B.S. stand for? I don't know. I said, I think I know. We're not that far removed from it, right? B.S. It's 153 years later. It was funny then. You know? So Private B.S. Henderson is hereby detailed or directed to proceed to his home near Vermilion Parish, Louisiana, to remount himself, to return within 30 days or be considered a deserter, and by orders of Scott Anderson. I mean, Scott Anderson's an actual Confederate officer. So they forged this. They had the signatures done by other prisoners. They even used different colored ink, different shades of gray and black ink. And this is what they need this. They're going to use this several times. So they're going to carry this with them throughout this second escape. The amazing thing is, Loring tells us where he goes. So when you look at the maps in the book, I didn't just make them up. They come from there. There it is. That's Loring's handwritten escape map. It gives, I know it's hard to see back there. I understand that. It gives us the dates, it gives us the mileage, it gives us the locations. We know exactly where Loring goes. He tells us. And then he draws a little map down here. It's like, son of a gun. And here they are. This is what they look like. Lieutenant Loring's on the left. You have Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Flory on the right. This is their Confederate escape outfits.
Oh.
Now, obviously, these were taken, and then, spoiler alert, they make it, but these are taken afterwards. But this is what they're wearing. This is exactly what they look like as they're out on the run. And I know it's difficult to see. You can see this in the book. When you look at Loring in particular, look at his feet. Loring was very concerned, how am I going to walk 300, 350 miles now to head back toward New Orleans? And my boots are a mess. The soles are flopping around, the heels were twisted. I mean, they're ruined. 2 days before the escape attempt, one of Loring's men from the Wave dies in the prison. And Loring says, I inherited his boots.
Oh.
But they were 3 sizes too big.
Oh.
So they're stuffing whatever he can. He's got an
Yeah.
extra pair of socks he puts in there, some of that grass, the insulation, he stuffs whatever he can in there. To the point, though, where you're going to walk 350 miles through all sorts of awful conditions, your boots are going to wear out. Night after night after night after night. For 25 days, these 2 men are going to walk from Hempstead, Texas, back essentially to New Orleans. For 25 days. They finally get to the point where Loring's boots just quit. His feet are absolutely covered in blisters. He loses every single toenail.
Ooh.
There's a chapter in there that's kind of disgusting. The last toenail. The last toenail. I can't imagine. His feet were a mess, an absolute mess. So he pulls out that little penknife, and he takes out his enameled cloth, a rubber blanket, a poncho, cuts that up, and he makes himself moccasins. And that's what he's wearing in that photo. Those are the moccasins that he's made. The family had these. Had. It's the one thing they could not identify. They didn't know what it was, and out it went. Don't throw anything away. So while I'm out there driving around, this is what they're going through. Now, I'm not trying to show you the road here. It's not a great photo, but everything on either side of it. There's this Texas scrub brush. So they get out of the prison camp, and for the first 100 miles, this is what they're walking through on either side. I couldn't take a photo. It was too dark. I tried a couple of times. I don't get anything. So you have to kind of go sideways through this stuff, or you got to crawl for 100 miles. Now, I drove it, and I was tired. For 100 miles, this is what they're going through. They finally reach the Sabine River, which is the boundary between Texas and Louisiana. They get to this point. They skirt around some Confederates. Burr's Ferry Bridge, how do we know? Because it's right on the map. And Loring tells us, we crossed at Burr's Ferry Bridge. It's still there today. This is down below the bridge. This is probably what it looked like at that time, because I'm right within a week of when they are there. It's very wide, it's very sandy, they get across. They're going to follow this south. They're going to head down to a place called Niblets, I love this, Niblets Bluff. Niblets Bluff on the Sabine River. So they follow this, I'm obviously kind of fast forwarding here. But they get to Niblets Bluff, and they're going to cross from there. They got to get across this. You can see the river, you can see in the distance the trees, it's really a swamp. But I took the photo because of the do not feed gator sign. I loved it. So this is a campground. You can go there today. I pulled in there, talked to the lady at the little campground office. Said, can I please go in and just look around and take some photos? She said, sure. There are Confederate breastworks that are still visible there today. I walked around those. And she did caution me. You know, you get down there and you open your mouth, they know you're not from there. So, you know, they hear me, it's like, you're not from around here. Okay. So be careful, if there are gators down there, don't go near it. So I didn't see any alligators. And it's interesting, Loring doesn't talk about alligators. So what I did find out is that in November and early December, because it does get cold and they're cold-blooded, they generally are not very active. I don't want to say they're hibernating, but they're not very active. I don't know a lot about alligators, which is good. So this is where they cross at Niblets Bluff. They get to a point where now they've been out walking for 20, 21, 22, 23 days. And they're living essentially on parched corn. And so you'll see this. It's almost like Homer's Odyssey as they're trying to find their way back home. Along the way, they run into all sorts of people. They run into all sorts of issues. They end up presenting that escape pass to a couple of different people, and Loring, as it turns out, has a silver tongue. And he can talk his way out of some of these things. Now, he adopted a southern drawl. I'd love to hear a Bostonian with a southern drawl. It must have been good because he fooled a few people. I think he had to. They were running for their lives.
All right.
It gets to the point where it's the 24th day. They know that they're getting close. Loring's feet are a mess. Flory is feverish. They're both starving. They lost a tremendous amount of weight. You've seen what they were wearing. They're just rags, just absolute rags. And maybe they have a half a handful of parched corn to eat. Loring's hamstrings contract, so he can't stand up. He is literally hunched over like this, and he cannot straighten his legs. And he has to walk in that fashion. Flory, in some cases, is crawling. And these two men realize it's either now or never. If we don't make it now, I don't think we're going to. They're within about 8 miles of Union lines at this location, Berwick's Bay in Louisiana. They've crossed through bayous, these rivers, the swamps. They're at the end. And Flory remembers, now he was a lieutenant colonel in the Army, and he had fought a year previously in locations very close to here with General Banks. He knew the area. And he realizes and says to Flory, I know a shortcut. I know how we can get to this Berwick's Bay, Morgan City a little faster. Follow me. And Loring says, absolutely, show me the way. And off they go. And if I had the map, I could show you this big bend in the river where they actually cut across. It saves them about 8 miles. They continue on, and they realize at this point they come to another bayou, a river. And Flory says, that's okay, there's a bridge up ahead. They get there, they come to the water, they stare out across, the bridge is gone. It's been burned. The bridge has been burned. And all that's left are the pilings, the wood pilings stretching across about 300 feet. They're not going to be able to swim. They're going to drown trying. What are they going to do? So they realize at this point, if we only had a board we could lay across those pilings, we could kind of shimmy our way across. They look around, they can't find anything. But they had passed some telegraph poles about a half-mile back that had been knocked over. So back they go. Loring's hunched over, Flory's trying to keep up. They go back, they find a telegraph pole that they're able to kind of push, kick, drag. They drag it the half-mile back. They get there, and they slowly push this across the pilings. And they inch their way across, and they make it. They get to the other side. The weather's starting to turn, it's starting to rain, but they keep pushing on. Flory realizes at that point, there's another bridge up ahead. And I don't know if it's still there. Neither man at this point feels that they have the strength to take that telegraph pole and walk another mile with it. So they leave it. And off they go. They fight their way through the cane and the brush and the brambles. And they get to the last bridge. This is it. They know on the other side of this river is freedom. They've come 350 miles in 25 days. And they've got about another quarter mile to go. They get to that river, they look across, and the bridge is gone. It's been burned. And all that's left are the pilings. And they look around, and there are no boards, there are no telegraph poles, there is nothing. All they can do is walk the mile back and try and find that telegraph pole and drag it back with them. Off they go. They find another board, not the telegraph pole. In this case, they find another long board. Take it, drag it back, and start to scoot across. It's raining hard now. It's getting cold. There's freezing rain. You saw what they were wearing. They don't have raincoats. Just these wool tatters that they're wearing. They shimmy across. And they continue, and they shimmy across. And they get to that last piling, and they slide that board out there. It's too short. It's too short. Flory screamed. Flory, at the top of his lungs, screams, looking to the heavens, saying, "What else do you want from us?" And he sinks down. Now, these pilings are about that big around. They're not huge. And both men are standing on this thing. And it's raining, it's slippery. And they're trying to figure out, now, how do we get across the last 50 to 75 feet? Flory's done. And Loring's standing there, the wind is blowing, they're freezing, their teeth are chattering, and suddenly on the wind, Loring hears something. The wind is blowing toward them, and Loring hears something. And he cocks his head, and he listens again. And he says to Flory, wait a minute, listen. And he hears it. He says, "Do you hear that?" He goes, "Yeah." And Loring says, "That's a bell. I hear a bell." And he'd heard this bell 1,000 times before. And it's not just any bell. It's a ship's bell. And it's a Union ship's bell. And Loring realizes at that point that they are really close. So they take that board, they slide it down into the water. Flory has a serape on, takes that off, ties that to a belt and suspenders. They lower themselves down into the water. And they swim the last 50 to 75 feet. They get to that bank, and they haul themselves up. There's actually a telegraph wire hanging down into the water. Pull themselves up. And they see in the distance something flapping in the breeze, and they think, these are Army tents. They head toward it. They get close. No, it's just some fabric. Just some fabric caught in some brush. And they continue on. And off in the distance, in the night, they see what they think are chimneys. It's like, there are chimneys. Let's head toward those. They walk further, and they realize now, oh my gosh, we're heading toward Union lines in a direction the Union would not expect us to be walking from. They're going to shoot who's ever coming from that direction. 350 miles, 25 days, and now we're going to get shot by our own guys? So every 10 steps, they yell out, "Huzzah! Huzzah!" as they walk toward freedom. They get closer, and they realize that those aren't chimneys. Those are the smokestacks of the Union gunboats in that bay. That's Berwick's Bay Landing. And the Union Navy was right there. They head down to the beach. The storm is raging, and Loring yells out, "Ahoy! There's 2 Union officers here. Send a boat immediately." And there's no response, no reply. So now what? There are a few houses, and they realize, we got to get out of the storm. We're soaked to the bone. It's about, it's freezing rain. We're going to die we're going to die in the weather here. So they find the nearest house. They knock on the door, say, "Let us in." Loring just demands, "Let us in." They hear the owner come running down the stairs and says, "Who's out there?" "Some Union officers." And the guy goes, "Well, how do I know that?" "I can't let you in. The Confederates nearby will burn my house down." Loring says, "You let us in now." And they have a dialogue. The man finally lets them in. They make a fire, and they spend the night inside. The storm continues to rage on. Flory lies in front of the fireplace to rest and falls asleep. Loring can't really sleep. Props himself in the corner because he can't stand up and he can't sit. And there he is, propped in the corner. Finally dozes off. Early in the morning, Flory wakes him and says, "It's time to go." They head back down to the beach, and here comes a rowboat with Union naval officers and sailors onto the beach. Now you saw these guys. They're dressed as Confederates. Now they have to convince these naval officers, we're on your side. We're on your side. It takes them about 20 minutes to do that. Finally, they provide information that only naval officers would know, Union naval officers would know, and they row them out to the ship. Ironically, they row them out to the USS Carabasset, which is a ship that Loring had commanded previously. So they've made it. They make it back to freedom. This is where they come. They started here in Hempstead. They head up to Huntsville. They continue on. You can follow these roads today. They are major routes. Here's the Sabine, all the way down to Niblets Bluff and Ballew's Ferry. They continue on out through here. Nothing but sugarcane. Have you seen sugarcane fields? I hadn't until I was out there. Incredibly thick. And they're walking through that to stay concealed until they make it here. 350 miles, 25 days. They make it back and they report for duty. Loring's health is absolutely ruined. Both men are sent back to New Orleans, and once they arrive there, there's a surprise waiting. You're going to have to read the book to figure out what
Oh, boy.
And they tell their story.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys are dressed in these tatters. They're finally given some new clothes. They tell their story, and people start to listen, and the news spreads quickly. And there's a local reporter nearby in New Orleans who picks this up and writes that story. So on January 28, 1865, this is the story of Loring and Florey that ran in Frank Dyson's illustrated newspaper on that date. I say this every time I do one of these lectures. If you have a copy of that, I have the money. I am looking for a copy of this, and I can't find it. Been to the National Archives. They have that date. They have that exact paper, and guess which page is missing? In the National Archives, no less. I can't find it. Seriously, if you ever run into this, call me. So this is the story. You see the woodcut here. Here's Loring. Here's Florey. You've already seen the actual carte de visite. From there, Loring and Florey part ways. I don't follow the research with Florey. I followed it with Loring, so I can't tell you what happens with Florey. But Loring, in this case, is sent back to Washington, D.C. He's in the Navy. That's where he enlisted. He's going to go back there and recuperate. So off he goes to Washington, D.C. It's December, January of 1865. The war is winding down. Loring's health is horrible. He can't really do anything. So he spends a couple of months just simply recuperating. He can't even eat. Because he had been starving, he has to eat many, many small meals in order to keep that down. Slowly, 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 he rebuilds his strength. Finally, to the point where he feels strong enough that he can do something, and he's assigned to the Washington Navy Yards as a rendezvous officer. So he's checking people in and out, kind of a quartermaster. And we know this because the family has the orders. They have the original orders saying, you are to go here on this date and report for duty. And then we have a letter on April 12th, 1865, with Loring's signature on it that says, I am the commanding officer of the Naval Rendezvous Center in Washington, D.C. That is 2 days before April 14th, 1865. Lee has surrendered. The war is ending. The country, it looks like, is going to come back together. Everybody's excited. Even President Lincoln is ecstatic. And decides, I'm going to celebrate by going to Ford's Theater. And I want to see a play called Our American Cousin. And word spreads very quickly. What better advertising can you get than the president's coming to my theater? So a lot of people hear this, and the Ford brothers spread that news. So Loring hears this and decides, I want to go to Ford's Theater. I want to see the president. And originally, it was supposed to be General and Mrs. Grant who were going to be attending with the Lincolns. But Mrs. Grant and Mrs. Lincoln didn't really get along. So the Grants begged off. So there it is. It's April 14th, 1865, and Lieutenant Loring is wearing that frock coat. And if you've been to Owego, to the Owego, or the Tioga County Historical Society, that is the frock coat in the museum that's on display. And that's the one that John Loring Ham and his family had, and they donated that to the museum in the 1980s. Loring's wearing that frock coat, and off he goes. He buys a ticket, says, I want to get there a little bit early, I want to get a good seat, and I want to see the president. And I want to see General Grant. So he hobbles off. He's still limping, probably can stand upright at that point, but off he goes, gets to Ford's Theater, shown his way in, takes his seat. He chooses a seat across from the presidential box. He wants to be able to see the president. Chatting with everybody, everybody's excited, the war's ending, president's coming, president's not arrived yet. Their attention turns to the stage and the play begins. About midway through the play, about 8:30 that evening, the president and Mrs. Lincoln arrive fashionably late. They arrive, the band strikes up, "Hail to the Chief." Everybody turns and looks, it's the president. Everybody applauds. Loring's thrilled. There's the band. But he doesn't recognize the other couple with the Lincolns. He sees a major, an army major, and another woman. He doesn't know who they are. Lincoln comes in, sits down in the rocking chair reserved just for him. The rest of the party enters. Everybody's attention turns back to the stage as the play continues. Loring says, "I can't help myself. I keep looking up at the president. Can't help it. I keep looking up there. There he is." But suddenly, the play becomes very funny. It's comedy. And Loring's attention is focused right on stage. And the funniest line that's to be delivered in the course of this play is about to be delivered by Harry Hawk. Harry Hawk is center stage. He's the only actor on stage. He gets up there, delivers his soliloquy, the monologue, and he says, "You old sock-dologizing man-trap." This is what happens every time. Nobody laughs. Because we don't get it. It is 19th century humor. You'll have to look it up in a 19th century dictionary. I'm not going to explain it now. That's very funny in 1865. And it's probably the last thing that President Lincoln hears. Because John Wilkes Booth has entered the presidential box, is standing behind the president as the president is leaning forward, laughing. Booth pulls out his single-shot Derringer, puts it behind the president's left ear, and pulls the trigger. And that is probably the single most tragic event in American history that has just occurred. Loring says, "I heard something. My head snaps around to a shot. And I'm staring directly at the presidential box." But he doesn't understand what's happening. Nobody does. There's stunned silence in the theater. You hear the bang? Henry Rathbone, the Army major, stands up, comes towards Booth. Booth only had one shot in the gun. Reaches inside his vest and pulls out a dagger about that long. Rathbone comes towards Booth. Booth raises the dagger, and Rathbone puts his left arm up. And Booth cuts him from here to the shoulder, lays him wide open. And the term that they use is he is staggered. He is injured so badly, he is staggered. And he is bleeding profusely. Moves out of the way, Booth jumps up, jumps down to the stage, and runs out the back. Loring realizes at this point something's not right. Something is not right. He is a combat veteran. This man has been through all sorts of peril and realizes something needs to be done. He springs into action, stands up, his hat, which was on his lap, falls to the floor. He runs to the stage, leaps up onto the stage, runs across to just below the presidential box. He is helped up into the box. People boost him up into there. And he tells us he is the second man to reach Lincoln. And I'm going to tell you right now that there are historians that will tell you that number one, I'm a lousy historian, number two, Loring's a liar. But I'm telling you that that man wearing that coat on April 14th, 1865, I'm taking his word for it. Second man to reach Lincoln, there's somebody already there. Loring identifies him, and this is what's really interesting. In Loring's personal journal, he says, "William R. Flood, a naval officer from the USS Primrose, is the first man there." That's been lost to history, folks. Loring identifies him. Lincoln's in the rocking chair. He's unconscious. They slide him out. They try to figure out what's wrong with the president. They realize he's been injured. What's wrong with him? They see Rathbone in the corner. Rathbone has been stabbed. They think the president has been stabbed. Loring reaches into his pocket, and what does he pull out? The penknife. That penknife. Loring's great-grandson has that penknife. I've held that in my own hands. It's about that big. It's very small. Little tiny penknife that he carried with him throughout the entire war. He's in the presidential box. He pulls that out. Lincoln's unconscious, and he can't breathe well. And Loring thinks, if I cut the president's necktie, that will relieve the pressure on his throat. He'll breathe more easily. And that's what he does. Pulls out the penknife, cuts the president's necktie, in the hopes that Lincoln will breathe more easily. The penknife is inscribed. There's writing on here. This knife cut the tie from the neck of President Lincoln when assassinated.
Oh.
Who puts that on a penknife when that hasn't happened? On the opposite side, it says B.W. Loring, USN Lieutenant, April 14, 1865. The family has that in their possession. He pulls that out, cuts the president's necktie. Does not help the president. They slide him out of that rocking chair. They're looking around. They're trying to figure out what's going on. There are people trying to come in to the presidential box. They're banging on that door. Booth had blocked that, so you couldn't get in.
Oh.
Imagine the chaos now. There are people down below running out, screaming, what's going on? There are people trying to get up into the box. They're trying to people break down the door. Loring in his uniform is barking orders. Finally, that door is broken down and a flood of people come in. Loring's taking charge. This is what he does. He's the commanding officer of several ships. And he says to somebody, nobody in particular, give me a larger knife. Somebody hands him a folding clasp knife. He takes that, opens the blade, and starts to cut the president's vest away. They think he's been stabbed. Flood, William Flood, is holding the president's head. And about that time realizes there's something sticky on my hand.
Yeah, right.
He pulls that out and realizes there's blood on my hand. The president's been shot in the head.
Yeah.
What do? All sorts of people are flooding in. Laura Keene, very famous British-American actress. It was her benefit night, which means she receives all the proceeds from the evening. That's how they get paid. She runs to the front of the presidential box and yells down to the crowd, brandy, bring brandy. It's a cure-all, right? Medicinal. I use it for it, right? So Laura Keene asks for brandy. I am sure people, I've got my flask. Somebody brings brandy up into the box. Loring is leaning over the president. Flood is there. Many people are around the president at this point. Laura Keene comes in with that brandy. She offers it. Now the president's unconscious. You can't swallow anything when you're unconscious. Loring realizes this. We're not going to do that. And in her haste, she dumps the brandy down Loring's back. There it is. And Loring yells, get that woman out of here.
Yeah, all right.
Now he's got brandy all over. It's the president. So they move Laura Keene off, go take care of Mrs. Lincoln, who's hysterical at this point.
Yeah.
People realize now the president is very badly wounded. There are surgeons coming into the presidential box. They realize he's not going to make it back to the White House. We need to find a location much closer to take the president. So they do. They find a location directly across the street in the Peterson House. And Loring tells us very clearly there are 4 men, sailors, soldiers, that carry President Lincoln across the street. And he says, I was one of those men. And he identifies his location. He said there was one man at the head, one man at the feet. I was on one side of the torso, there's a man across from me. And we slid our hands under the president and clasped hands.
Yeah.
And we carried the president across the street to the Peterson House, where he would expire the next morning. Again, imagine the chaos that's occurring. It happens so quickly. Take the president across the street, lay him on the bed, and Loring walks out. What just happened? He continues walking, finds himself deep in thought, walks past this location. This is in the Washington Navy Yards. This is a guardhouse, sentry house. It's there today. He walked past that sentry house on his way back to the Washington Navy Yards. The president's been killed. The war's ending. We thought everything was going to be fine, and it's not. simply ends. Loring's discharged, and now he needs to continue on with his life. He thought perhaps he could make a career in the United States Navy, but when he got back to the Washington Navy Yards, he finds out that his name has been dragged through the mud. Surrendered his ship. Didn't have any coal. What's he supposed to do? He had 59 men fighting off 350 Confederates. But Admiral Porter said, it doesn't matter, you surrendered your ship. And not a single one of your men was killed outright. What men are these? So Loring's chances of continuing on in the United States Navy are dashed. He takes a position with the Revenue Cutter Service, which is the predecessor to the United States Coast Guard. And he will spend a career now in the Revenue Cutter Service, always wanting to achieve the rank of captain. He finally becomes a first lieutenant, but is never able to pass the physical exam to become a captain. In the 1870s, he leaves the Revenue Cutter Service, and he settles in Owego, New York. He marries, he has 5 children, 3 of whom survive to adulthood. And this is Lieutenant Loring in the post-war years. He would not speak often of his time in the Navy during the war. He did not speak often of his time in Camp Gross, and rarely, if ever, did he talk about the night of April 14, 1865. As he grew older, the family actually was quite poor. He never asked for a pension from the United States government. In 1900, his good friend, United States Senator Thomas Collier Platt from Owego, New York, decided that he wanted to recognize his good friend for his service, and he introduced a bill into the United States Senate, that bill, S-281. And in it, Platt talks about Loring's service during the war, and most importantly, the night of April 14, 1865. It's in the Senate record. It states in the Senate record that Loring was there in the presidential box and assisted the president. It's been lost to history. It was read 3 times. 3 times on the Senate floor, introduced by the Treasury Committee. And each time there was no action taken. And Platt pleaded with his colleagues on the Senate floor, please take some action. It was finally referred back to the committee, where it lingered and it died. On December 2nd, 1902, 18 months after that bill was introduced in the United States Senate, Lieutenant Benjamin W. Loring passed away. Today he is buried in Evergreen Cemetery. Thank you. So there's another piece to this. Wow. Sorry. That jacket is alleged to have President Lincoln's blood on it. And this is the part that some of you may remember. Several of us, have done some testing on that jacket, going back to 1999 and 2000. Jonathan Zisk, Dr. Zisk, our chemistry teacher from the school, I think just retired a year ago, I think. He and I teamed up in 2000. I knew the history side, but I needed somebody who knew the science. He's got a PhD from Cornell in organic chemistry. What better guy could you find to help you out with some science? So I approached the museum, approached the board of directors, the executive directors, and said, here's what we want to try and do. Now, in 1999-2000, what's on TV? CSI. Well, I watched it like everybody else, thought, well, we can do that. So, why not? Let's prove it. Forensically. We're going to prove forensically that Loring was in the presidential box because Lincoln's blood's on that jacket. So, Dr. Zisk and myself got together, and he made a couple of phone calls, and out in Huntsville, Alabama, he got a hold of a colleague, and they from a crime lab, state crime lab, and they shipped us some luminol. And it's like, I don't know what to do with it. Jonathan did, thank God. So we got that. We got permission at the school. I borrowed the jacket. I really borrowed the jacket with their permission.
All right.
Took it to school. Mr. Casiola was very kind to allow us to use the dark room. The photography teacher allowed us to use the dark room. We took that jacket downstairs after school one day. Jonathan mixed up the chemicals, the luminol, and we spritzed that jacket.
Yeah.
And guess what? That jacket luminesces. There's blood on that jacket.
Uh-huh.
There's no doubt in my mind there's blood on that jacket.
Uh-huh.
Now, it's interesting because that luminol, when it luminesces,
Yeah.
it reacts with iron. So what's in your blood? The hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has iron in it.
Yeah.
And so when we did that, there were several sections on this jacket that luminesced. Now, when you go to the museum today and you're looking at that thing, if you look
Yeah.
right around in this area, you're going to see a very faint white outline. That's one of the samples that we took. So we were so brilliant. We get in there, it's like, well, what if it luminesces? So how do we mark it? It's like, oh, what's a teacher have in those days? What do you got in your pocket? Chalk. On a piece of chalk.
Oh.
There we go. So we marked those locations on the jacket. We outlined it with chalk so we knew where it was.
Oh.
Then we teamed up with the Rochester Museum and Science Center. And we found a conservator there who would work with us to take some samples. Then I made about 1,000 phone calls and found a geneticist in New Orleans, Dr. Sudhir Sinha from Reliagene Labs, and I basically begged, told him the story and begged, would you help us out? He flew up here. So Jonathan and I got a day off of school. We went to Rochester, went to the museum, took the jacket with us. This guy flew in, we picked him up at the airport, took him over to the museum, met Ralph Wiegand, the conservator, took the jacket in there, into the lab, and they took samples. Sinha took those samples with him, and he was in New York for like 2 hours. Took it back to the airport, took those samples, went back to New Orleans to the lab. And then 9 months later, we're gonna have a baby. 9 months later, we get some results. And guess what? It was inconclusive. So, but you gotta ask yourself, what if it had been conclusive?
Yeah.
What if it come back and we said, oh, we get DNA, we have blood DNA on there.
Yeah.
How do we know it's Lincoln's? You should be asking yourself, maybe it's not Lincoln's. Who was bleeding in the presidential box other than Lincoln? Rathbone.
Yeah.
Profusely. I mean, he almost died. He didn't. He almost died from that. So maybe it's Rathbone's blood. I don't know. We know it's blood. I have to be honest here. I don't know it's human blood. I just know it's blood. You would not believe the number of phone calls that I made to museums and other places and locations asking if they would collaborate with myself and Jonathan, that if we came up with something, could we get a sample of what you have and compare it to what we have?
Yeah.
Now I have to be very careful with what I'm about to tell you, because I'll get nailed for libel, and I'm serious. But I'm going to give you a snippet, and you can go home and Google it. You'll see it come up. So, one of the first places we went to is the Collins Museum, Pike County, Pennsylvania. Type in the Lincoln flag. That's all you got to type in. The Lincoln flag. And it will come up. And in this museum, they have an American flag. And here's what they claim. That flag was in front of the presidential box at Ford's Theater the night Lincoln's assassinated.
Oh, yeah.
Somebody tore it down, rolled it up, put it under Lincoln's head. You don't put the president's head on the floor, right? And Lincoln's blood is on that flag.
Oh.
So, Hattie and I, my wife, one Saturday, we truck on down there. I made a little appointment with Charles Clausen, the director. Want to come down, talk to you, see this flag. We get down there. It's like, son of a gun, that flag is covered in blood. I mean, it's just soaked. So I explained to him what I'm trying to do. He says, oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
He goes, yeah, I think we could probably work something out. And then, this is the thing that sticks in my head. He says, oh, you know, when we were having that flag conserved, we had the blood on there actually tested. We know Lincoln's blood type.
Oh.
You've got to be kidding. I get goosebumps today thinking about it.
There you go.
You know Lincoln's blood type? He goes, yeah, I got the report. I'll be right back. He goes into the back room. 15 minutes later, he comes back and he's like, I can't find it. Wait a minute. All right, come on. You misplaced Lincoln's blood? Come on. He goes, I know it's here. He goes, I swear it's type A. I've seen it. I've read the report. It's like, huh, okay. Really interesting. So we talk a little bit more. It's like he's going to call me in a couple of days, and we part ways. I come home. A couple of days go by, no phone call. A couple more, I can't stand it. I'll confess right now, my free period, I used to sneak down to the coach's office and use the phone. Call these places. Probably owe some money. Phone bill, I don't know. So I would call them and say, hey, remember me? And all of a sudden this guy's demeanor and tenor changed completely. Yeah, I remember you. We're not doing that. No way. Now, this is where the libel comes in. You look it up, you read about it, and you can be the detective and figure out why Charles Clausen was fired. And that's all I'm going to say. I can't say any more. But there's a whole lot of other stuff that went on because we threw a little bit of doubt into their Lincoln flag. You figure that out. We spent a lot of time researching this. We sent other samples out again in 2008. I sent them to the Paleo DNA lab at Lakehead University in Canada. They took a look at that as well. We also had obtained, at that point, I had obtained Lincoln hair. You can get it online. I've got multiple hair samples that have good provenance that claim that it's from Lincoln, and we got results. I have mitochondrial DNA results from the hair. And I think I can legitimately claim I'm the first person to get partial DNA results related to Lincoln. But we don't have anything to compare it to. Made hundreds of phone calls. I had people hang up on me, and I had people swear at me. The best one, you'll have to ask your superintendent, Mr. Kislowski, because he was the principal at the time. I'll never forget it. I was up in my classroom, teaching away. Comes up, says, Rick, somebody on the phone wants to talk to you. I was like, well, I'm kind of teaching. He goes, no problem, I'm going to take your class. I think you need to go downstairs and answer the phone. So I go downstairs, pick up the phone, hello, and this guy chews me out for about 5 minutes. And I've got the phone out here, and it's the chief historian, Michael Mahoney, from Ford's Theater. It had hit the story had hit the papers, it had gone across the AP wire, and this guy was livid. How dare you? You are a nobody. Bleep, 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 bleep. Bleep, bleep, bleep. I had a nickel for every time. Bleep, bleep, bleep. You get the idea. He was furious. I mean, it was embarrassing. I'm in the middle of the office, no privacy. I got the phone out here. Colleen Jastrzemski, the secretary at the time, is kind of looking at me. What? It's a parent? What do you know? Not this time. Just the chief historian. So there are a lot more stories like that. That's not in the book. I don't tell that stuff in other places. So anyway, there you have it. That's what we've been doing. In 2000, John Hamm was kind enough to come to Owego and meet with me. Emma Cedar set up the meeting. I was able to meet with him. He brought that penknife with him. He and his wife came up and shared some information with me, which was wonderful. And we said goodbye. 14 years later, I mean, I talked with John once, that one time, got his contact information and so forth, tried to find this DNA stuff. In 2014, I was a dean up at Mohawk Valley Community College, and it's like, I need some closure. I got to do something here. I want to write this book. I don't know what else to do. And I thought, well, I'll call this guy. 14 years later, I went through my old notes, found his number. It took me about 5 days to screw up the courage to actually call him. And I called, and he answered the phone. John answered the phone. Said, hi, Richard Quest, this whole Loring thing, Lincoln DNA, do you remember me? He goes, oh my God, yeah. Really? Yeah. He says, yeah, I do. I said, well, here's what I'm trying to do. I'd like to write a book about your great-grandfather. I would like to sit down with you and your wife and talk about this. Is it possible to meet? This was in May of 14. He said, I would love to, but it's like, but I'm getting ready to retire. Actually, it was in April. He said, I'm getting ready to retire in a month. My wife and I are retiring, and we need about a month to kind of get our affairs in order. Can I call you back? It's like, okay, yes. I thought, no way. He did. He's a man of his word, just like his great-grandfather. He called me back a month later, said, yep, let's talk about this. Why don't you and your wife come on out? They live in Pittsburgh. We drove out there, met with them for a couple of days, and when we got to the house, there was just volumes of papers and documents.
No.
But you would not believe what they have. You wouldn't. It's incredible, absolutely incredible. And from there, we forged an incredible friendship. They lent me for 4 years all the documents,
Wow.
and had the opportunity to go through them, put them in order, read through them, transcribe them,
Yep.
and you have the final product.
Ah.
Thank you very much. I've gone on. Any questions? Happy to answer some questions. Yes.
How did he end up in Owego?
So, you know, that's a really good question. Nobody knows for sure, including John. They don't exactly know for sure. They have some distant relatives in Campville, and they think that maybe he came out in this general direction. Nellie Cahoon, his wife, was from the area, but originally how he came out here, I couldn't tell you. One of his sons, Jay Alden Loring, you may recognize that name, was a naturalist and would accompany Teddy Roosevelt on his African safari after Roosevelt's second term in office. Other questions? Yes?
I've read other historical accounts that put a physician in Lincoln's box. In your opinion, do you think that Loring was mistaken as that physician?
Not that one. So Dr. Charles Leal, and everybody agrees on this, Dr. Charles Leal was definitely in the presidential box. A very young man. I think he was 22, 23. He'd been out of medical school, I want to say a month, somewhere in there, but he happened to be in the audience that night, and so he does respond to the presidential box. I do believe that Loring is mistaken for a surgeon. I really do. And I have read other accounts where people have said, other eyewitness accounts that, oh, there's a surgeon in there, don't worry, he'll take care of Lincoln. So I believe that. I do believe that. I mean, imagine the chaos that's occurring. And here's somebody who's actually hovering over the president, trying to render aid. In the moment, it makes sense that would be a doctor.
Yeah.
But I can tell you other historians will disagree with that completely. And I've been dinged, but I don't care. Okay. I'm telling you, Loring was there. I'm telling you. Other questions? Yes?
There's not going to be a quiz on this, or should we get the school to dig up those phone bills?
So,
Oh, boy.
yeah, I think statute of limitations or something along the line. We'll have to talk, and yeah, you'll end up in detention anyway. I know.
Donation to the booster club.
Any other questions?
You will autograph our book.
Yes, I will. Yes, I will do that. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming out tonight. Thank you.
If you're here at event, sign the attendance sheet, please do that. Well, up there.
Sign. Yep.